Hey guys, here's your notes on not criminal science. Hi, let me start over. Hi guys, here's your notes on crime scene processing. So these notes are a little bit longer, so please feel free to break it up into a couple of small chunks, and then you don't have to do them all at once. So I apologize, but they're a little bit longer. So crime scene processing is what we're going to talk about. Basically, the gist of it is that you're going to be collecting physical evidence from a crime scene. And that obviously is going to be used to help solve the crime, figure out what happened, and all that kind of stuff. So physical evidence is considered any object that can establish that a crime has been committed or can link a crime and its victim to a perpetrator. Forensic science begins at the crime scene. The investigator must recognize physical evidence and properly preserve it for laboratory investigation. The evidence must be kept in its original state as much as possible. So obviously we don't want to be like messing with it, changing it, making it look different in any way, shape, or form. We want it to be as exactly the way we found it at the crime scene. One of the first jobs of a first responder after providing any sort of life support or first aid would be to secure and isolate the crime scene. So it's the first priority of the first priority is medical assistance to individuals and arresting the perpetrator. Certainly if someone is in the act of committing a crime, we are less worried about the integrity of the crime scene and we're more worried about catching the person who did it. Ropes and barricades and guards will prevent unauthorized access to the area. So that's where you see the crime scene tape is usually going to come in. Every person who enters a crime scene has the potential to destroy physical evidence. So the lead investigator evaluates the scene and determines the boundaries. They do an initial walkthrough and develop a strategy. All items must be documented and photographed. So typically if a crime occurs within a house, just the house isn't the crime scene. The whole property is the crime scene, depending on how big the property is. Or if there's a crime just in one room, that doesn't mean it's just one room is going to be the crime scene. There's going to be the perimeter is going to be a lot bigger than just the one place where the actual crime took place. So there are three methods of recording the crime scene. You're going to take pictures, you'll do sketches, and you'll take notes. Ideally, you should be using all three. No one needs you to be like a world-class artist to be the sketch person, because typically what they do is you're taking sketches and measurements and sort of a rough sketch, and then you take them back to the lab and you input the information into a computer and you end up with this sort of a rendering that looks a lot better than anything I can draw. I don't know about you guys. The crime scene should be unaltered. Unless injured people are involved, the objects must not be moved until they have been photographed from all necessary angles. If things are removed, added, or positions are changed, the photographs may not be admissible as evidence. So you may not be able to use the evidence in court. Things should be photographed completely. So it should be the area where the crime took place and adjacent areas at various angles. So if it was inside a house in the dining room, you're going to take pictures of the dining room, of course. You're going to take pictures of various angles of the kitchen and the living room and the other parts of the house. You're also going to take various pictures of the outside as well, so that you make sure you get angles of everything you can possibly think of. If a crime scene includes a body, take photos to show the body's location and position relative to the whole crime scene. Take close-up photos of injuries and weapons lying near the body. After the body is removed, photograph the surface underneath. When the size is significant, you can use a ruler or other measuring scales. Usually they use those L-shaped squares that will give you the size of something. Digital cameras will allow for enhancement and examination of fine detail. So now, more often than not, people use digital cameras. Obviously, before that was a thing, they did not. Videotaping a scene is also becoming popular. They will videotape the scenes on mute, though. They will not be using sound when they videotape the scene, so that they won't pick up any of their sort of musing. Sometimes you'll walk through the crime scene and you'll have like kind of suspicions on what you think is happening, but you really don't want to come to any of those conclusions until you're done processing the crime scene and processing all of the evidence. So they will kind of keep that on mute so that whoever's listening to the tape at any other given time isn't swayed by whatever the person is saying over the top. Also, crime scene investigators, sometimes, it's a tough job. You're going to see a lot of weird things. You're going to see a lot of really sad things. People often develop sort of what they refer to as like a sixth sense of humor. And so sometimes they have been known to say some somewhat inappropriate things that are kind of funny, but they're still inappropriate. So they would not want that caught on tape. That could get them in trouble. But that is sort of how a lot of times crime scene investigators process and deal with the horrible things that they see, is that they have to kind of lighten it up, or that's kind of how they deal with it. So they just don't want it on tape for the whole world to hear what nonsense they've said. So sketches, again, once the photos are taken, you'll sketch the whole scene. It's a rough sketch. It's drawn at the crime scene, and it contains an accurate depiction of the dimensions of the scene and shows the location of all the objects having a bearing on the case. So it is a rough sketch, but it is accurately measured. It's important that you know the dimensions of the room, the dimensions of the area, how far from fixed objects were things. So if the body was found in the middle of the floor, okay, how far was it from this wall? How far was it from this wall? How far was it from this rolling chair? Okay, well, great. You could measure that, but the chair rolls, so it's not a fixed point. So you definitely want to mark where the chair was, but the chair is movable versus the walls and things like that. They're a little bit more stationary. All measurements are made with measuring tape. It will show, you'll show all the items of evidence, and you'll assign each item a number or a letter and list it in a legend. You'll also show a compass heading designating north. A finished sketch will be precise, and the rendering of the crime scene, it's usually drawn to scale, and it's also usually done using a CAD program or something along those lines, some sort of computer-generated program. Certainly, I can't draw very good. So here's an example of a rough sketch, and you can see they still have all the measurements in there. They're using what looks like cone symbols. And you can see down below, every time I move down, the little thing pops up, sorry. But you can see down below, they have letters, I think behind this little recording thing I have here, it's, has the symbol for the cones and stuff like that. And it tells you what they all mean. And then instead of having to go and draw a knife or a gun, you just here's an X, and that's a knife. All the X's are weapons. All the X's are this kind of weapon, whatever. This way you can simplify your drawing. So then they take it back to the lab, and the computer generates this much nicer, cleaner. But again, measurements are all still intact. Measurements from fixed points to the couch, bookcases, things like that. Obviously, you can still move a couch and a table, but they're still kind of fixed points. When you're taking notes, you must be constantly taking notes actively throughout the process of throughout processing the crime scene. The notes may be the only source of information sometimes to refresh your memory. Tape recording notes at a scene can be advantageous, but again, you're also potentially able to pick up things on that tape that you might not necessarily want a lot of other people to hear. So sometimes you have to be careful with the tape recorded notes. Dealing with physical evidence. So once found, physical evidence must be collected and stored in a way that preserves its integrity for forensics comparison and analysis. The search for physical evidence must be thorough and systematic, even when suspects are immediately seized. So even if you show up to a scene and there's the guy with the gun in his hand and you watch him shoot the victim, you still have to search for evidence in a systematic way. You can't just wander willy-nilly all around the crime scene and try to just, it's like, where's Waldo? You can't do that. Okay. So forensic scientists are not usually needed at the scene unless the evidence is complex or it's a major crime. Typically the police officers are trained to have like field evidence technicians that will be in charge of collecting evidence, and they bring it back to the lab, and then the forensic scientists deal with it there. That's what I keep saying about how a lot of those CSI shows, they don't usually all go out into the field and all bring the stuff back and do all the evidence analysis. That's usually split up into multiple jobs. So searching the scene, again, has to be systematic. One person should supervise and coordinate, include all the probable entry and exit points in the search, front doors, back doors, side doors, garage doors, whatever, windows even. What to search for will be determined by the particular circumstances of the crime. So you'll be searching for different things if it was a homicide versus being like a hit and run. In most crimes, a search for latent fingerprints is required. Latent means invisible prints. So here's a couple of examples of ways that you could do a systematic search. You can do spiral searches, which again, you can do one person doing a spiral. You can do multiple people side by side doing a spiral as well. You could do the grid method. This is also another one-person grid method where you go across everything and then you can follow the arrows. You go up and down everything. This is a strip or a line search. So you can do one and just keep going up and down, but it's better to have a couple people going up and back and up and back. Or you can do it by quadrant or zone and say, okay, I'm going to search this first whole area of this quadrant, and then this, and then we'll move on. Physical evidence can be anything from massive objects to microscopic trace. It may be necessary to take custody of all clothing worn by the participants in a crime scene. You're going to handle carefully and wrap separately to avoid the loss of trace evidence. That should be trace underneath there. Yep, trace evidence. I'll put myself back down here. Critical areas of the crime scene should be vacuumed and the sweepings submitted to the lab for analysis. Mobile crime scene vehicles can also carry supplies to protect the crime scene, photo collect and package evidence, and to help develop latent prints. So sometimes they have those they're like big RVs usually, and they're the mobile crime scenes or the mobile crime units. The integrity of evidence is best maintained, excuse me, it's best maintained when the item is kept in its original condition as found at the crime scene. The entire object should be sent to the lab. If evidence is found adhering to a larger structure, remove that specimen with forceps or another appropriate tool. So in the case of a blood stain, one may either scrape the stain off a surface. So let's say like there's blood on the wall. Well, you're not going to take the whole wall down. You might cut a section of the drywall out and take that. Or you might just scrape the stain off the surface, transfer the stain to a moistened swab, and or cut the area out. So you also might do that with a carpet. If it's wall-to-wall carpeting, you're not going to take the whole carpet to the crime lab, but you might cut a section of the carpet out, or you might swab it with a moistened swab and swab it and take the sample back to the lab. Each different item or similar items collected at different locations must be placed in separate containers. So just because you found matches and there's a match in one room and then there's a match in another room and there's a match in another room doesn't mean they all go together. They have to stay separate because they're all found in separate locations, even though they're similar. Packaging evidence separately prevents the damage through contact and prevents cross-contamination. And the day's over, but I'm going to keep going. Sorry. The autopsy room is a place where the medical examiner or the coroner carefully examines the victim to establish a cause and manner of death. Cause of death is different than manner of death, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. That was in your web quest a little bit too, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. Tissues are retained for pathological and toxicological, that's a big word, examination. The following are collected and sent to the lab. The victim's clothing, fingernail scrapings, head and pubic hairs, blood for DNA typing, vaginal, anal, or oral swabs, especially in sex-related crimes, recovered bullets from the body, and then hand swabs from shooting victims because they're looking for GSR, which is gunshot residue. Tools for evidence collection. You might use forceps, which are basically like big tweezers. Unbreakable plastic pill bottles with pressure lids, so you'll put things inside there. You might use manila envelopes, glass vials, or pill boxes. You might use paper bags. Sometimes paper bags are better than plastic. Sometimes plastic is better than paper. It depends on what you're collecting. Fire evidence must be kept in an airtight container to prevent evaporation of petroleum residues. So that's the one that's pretty specific. It has to be in like a glass airtight container. And then clothing must be air dried and placed in individual paper bags. I'm not sure what that link is, but I think it's a link to shop for crime scene processing supplies. So the chain of custody. The chain of custody is a list of all people who came into contact into possession of an item of evidence. So the chain must be established whenever evidence is presented at court as an exhibit. So the failure to do so may lead to questions regarding authenticity and integrity of evidence. All items should be carefully packaged and marked upon their retrieval at crime sites. Normally, the collector's initials and date of collections are inscribed directly on the article. The evidence container must also be marked with the collector's initials, location of evidence, and the date of collection. So my best examples are usually in NCIS, if anybody watches NCIS. Whenever they bring Abby some evidence, a lot of times it comes from autopsy, from Ducky. Whenever they bring her evidence, she has to sign for it. That's continuing the chain of evidence. That's the way that they say is this was picked up at the crime scene and no one tampered with it in between. It was picked up at the crime scene and it went from this person to this person. And then this person had custody of it and took care of it and no one tampered with it. The reason that you have to establish this is because you could go to court and say, well, my blood, I'm the bad guy, but my blood is on that person's shirt because so-and-so put it there. Well, when did so-and-so put it there? Oh, after the evidence was collected, it was left unattended. It wasn't signed for. People didn't know it was sitting there, and someone came along and set me up. Okay, so that's the whole purpose of the chain of custody, is to avoid anyone being able to say, oh, this person set me up after the fact. So it's really important that they keep track of exactly who's had what pieces of evidence and when. Here's a couple of different evidence bags. There's the 4 steps that I was talking about. There's a plastic evidence bag and some paper evidence bags. Standard reference samples. So the examination of evidence often requires something called a standard reference sample. A standard reference sample is basically a physical piece of evidence whose origin is known, such as blood or hair from a suspect that can be compared to the crime scene evidence. So let's say we find blood at a crime scene. Well, we don't know whose it is. And unless we have someone, a suspect or victim's sample to compare it to, we're never going to be able to match it. It's the same thing with DNA. It's the same thing with fingerprints. You can collect all the fingerprints you want at a crime scene, but if you don't have a database of fingerprints to compare it to, it doesn't make a difference. So that's what that is. The standard reference sample is something that you can compare it to. So if you're trying to rule yourself out, you might say, here's a lock of my hair. You can rule me out as a suspect because you can now compare my DNA to the DNA that you found at the crime scene, and you'll see that it's not a match, hopefully. But that's the whole point, is to have that standard. So sometimes they'll take, from crime scenes, they'll also take toothbrushes, or they'll take hairbrushes, or things like that that would help them create a standard reference sample that is a known person's reference, so they can compare them. This is all the same kind of thing. Bloodstained evidence must be accompanied by a whole blood or buccal swab. Buccal is just the inside your cheek. Sample obtained from all relevant crime scene participants. Buccal swab is a swab of the inner cheek performed to collect cells for use in determining the DNA profile of an individual. Some types of evidence must also be accompanied by the collection of substrate controls. So, for example, arson scenes. The substrate control is an uncontaminated surface material close to an area where physical evidence has been deposited. It's used to ensure that the surface on which the sample has been deposited does not interfere with laboratory tests. So you're testing the top of this table that's charred completely. So maybe you're going to take a sample of the bottom of the table where there's not as much char. So then you can say, okay, this XYZ that we're seeing in this charred sample is actually just from the table, and we don't have to worry about that. But these other things are from the fire or from other pieces of evidence that are important there, because they're not on the underside. They're not on the part that wasn't as badly damaged. When submitting evidence to the lab, evidence is submitted to the lab either by personal delivery or by mail shipment. It's mostly personal delivery. Most labs require that an evidence submission form accompany all evidence. Again, this is to maintain the chain of custody. It enables the lab analyst to make an intelligent, complete examination of the evidence. It provides a brief description of the case history and the examiner, so the examiner can analyze in a logical sequence. The particular kind of examination requested for each type of evidence should also be delineated, which means to be marked or let people know. Any list of all items submitted must be included. Death and autopsies. So forensic pathology involves the investigation of unnatural, unexplained, or violent deaths. Forensic pathologists, in their role as medical examiners or coroners, are charged with determining cause of death. The forensic pathologist may conduct an autopsy, which is the medical dissection and examination of a body, in order to determine the cause of death. Estimating the time of death. After a human body expires, there are several stages of death. There's rigor mortis, liver mortis, and algor mortis. They are different, I call them the mortises, different mortises. Basically, rigor mortis is body stiffening. Liver mortis is the result of blood settling. So right now, currently in our bodies, our blood is flowing. If our blood stops flowing, it sinks to the lowest portion of our body because it's going to go with gravity. And then algor mortis is the loss of heat, which is a lot of times what you'll see them measuring on TV shows when they're looking at liver temperatures and things like that. That's one of the big ones that they use on TV to determine. the time of death is to see what the current body temperature is, and they do some math calculations. This is all stuff that we're going to do this year and learn how to do. There are some other specialties that we'll talk about throughout this year. There's forensic anthropology, which is looking at human skeletal remains. Forensic entomology, which is the study of insects and their relation to criminal investigations, which again goes along with time of death. So determining time of death based on the bugs that have inhabited the body, which is kind of gross, but very predictable. And then forensic psychology. A lot of you guys are probably interested in profiling and understanding how the mind works and what causes some people to be more predisposed to become criminals and things like that, because it's a cross between human behavior and how that relates to legal things. Here's just a picture of the life cycle of a bug. It's very predictable, and so it helps us to determine what time or how long a body has been in a certain location. Here are some other specialties. Forensic odontology is teeth. Forensic engineering is concerned with like accident reconstruction, origins of fires, explosive, things like that. Forensic computer science, digital evidence, obviously. Most of these things are types of jobs that we'll talk about this year, and if we get lucky, maybe we can zoom in some people who do these jobs and talk to you about them. Crime scene safety, wear gloves, wear PPE. Basically, you all know what PPE is now because of the coronavirus. So wear PPE. They're supposed to always wear gloves. Crime scene investigators actually will wear a full suit, so it's not like you see on TV where they're dressed in their high heels and their fancy clothes. They will always wear like a full body suit. It's called a Tyvek suit. Literally only their faces will be showing, and they'll usually have goggles on as well. And often they'll be wearing a mask. Even before COVID, they were wearing masks. So they're literally as covered as possible. Part of that is to protect them from whatever might be in the crime scene, but it's also to protect the crime scene from them. So if they went back to the lab and they analyzed this piece of hair that they found, and they found out it was their own piece of hair, they're going to be like, oh, just because my hair was there because I was there, and that's the only reason that it was there, not because that had anything to do with the crime. But now they're also going to have some explaining to do. No, I swear I wasn't. It's just because I collected my own hair accidentally at the crime scene. So they're better off to stay as covered as possible so that they don't have that happen. Okay, so I think that is the last slide. You can obviously pause or replay any parts of this. I kind of read through it pretty fast. So if you need to pause or do anything to replay it to fill in your notes, you can go ahead and do that. And that will be no problem. And if you don't have any questions, I will see you guys next time. Thanks for watching.